I didn't think I'd ever share this story. I've convinced myself for years that it was my imagination, but no matter how many excuses I make, I can't forget the details. If you've ever had something inexplicably horrifying happen, you'll know what I mean. It clings to you like a cobweb you can't brush off. I moved to Oak Ridge Estates after my divorce. It's one of those neighborhoods that looks ripped from a glossy brochure, manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and neighbors who wave but never stop long enough to have a real conversation. It was perfect, too perfect, in hindsight. The kind of place where nothing should go wrong, where the worst thing that happens is someone forgetting to take in their trash cans. My house was on a cul-de-sac, 3 down from the community pool. I wasn't much of a swimmer, but the proximity made the place seem more valuable, so I figured it was a win. I hardly paid attention to the pool during my first few weeks. Then, one night, I heard the sound of splashing. It was around 2 a.m. and I'd been reading in bed when I caught the noise. At first I thought it might be rain, but when I peeked out my window, the stars were perfectly clear. The splashing was faint but rhythmic, like someone swimming laps. I assumed a teenager had snuck in for a midnight dip. I ignored it and went back to my book. The next night the splashing came again. I checked my phone and saw it was just after 2 a.m., the same as before. This time I couldn't resist stepping outside. From my porch I could see the pool faintly lit by the overhead lamps that always stayed on. The water looked undisturbed, no ripples, no movement. I told myself it was the wind and went back inside. The sound persisted every night, splashing always faint, always rhythmic, always at the same time. I started losing sleep. It wasn't just the noise, it was the way it made me feel. It was hard to explain, but I felt watched. Not just at night, all the time. One evening I mentioned it to Greg, my next-door neighbor. He smiled and said that I was hearing things. But then, just before walking away, he casually added that I should stay out of the pool house. He said it lightly, like a joke, but his face turned too serious. I didn't even know the pool had a house. I went down to check it out the next afternoon. The pool house was small, squat, and painted the same beige as everything else in the neighborhood. It stood at the far end of the pool, near the fence. The windows were frosted glass, and the door had a simple padlock. There was nothing unusual about it. Still, I felt the hair on my neck stand up as I stood there. It wasn't the pool house itself that unnerved me. It was the absolute silence around it. No birds, no breeze, just quiet. That night the splashing was louder. It woke me up, though I'd gone to bed wearing earplugs. My heart was pounding before I was even fully awake. This time I decided to see for myself. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out. The air was cold and still, but the closer I got to the pool, the heavier it felt. The splashing stopped the moment I crossed the street. I shone my flashlight over the water. It was completely calm, not even a ripple. I stood there for a long time, watching, listening. Nothing. Then I heard the sound behind me. It wasn't splashing this time, but something faint, like a creak. I turned toward the pool house. The door, the one with the padlock, was slightly open. I couldn't see inside. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness. I should have turned around. I should have gone back home, locked my doors, and called someone. Instead, I stepped closer. The smell hit me first. Damp, musty, with an underlying hint of something metallic. The kind of smell you instinctively know isn't right. I hesitated at the threshold. My flashlight flickered. I told myself that it was the batteries, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Inside, the floor was wet. Not puddled, but damp enough to glisten under the weak light. The smell was stronger, almost suffocating. The room was small and empty, except for a single folding chair in the corner. There was no reason for me to stay, no reason to keep looking. But then I noticed the door at the back of the room. It wasn't locked. It was barely even closed, just resting against the frame. My hand shook as I pushed it open. The room beyond was larger than it should have been. Much larger. It felt like stepping into a cave. The walls were rough, damp stone, and the air was thick with humidity. I didn't understand how this could exist under a suburban pool house. My flashlight flickered again, and that's when I saw them. They weren't people. Not anymore. There were 3 of them huddled in the far corner. Their skin was pale and glistening, stretched too tight over their bones. Their faces, if you could call them faces, were slack, the eyes sunken and dark. One of them turned toward me, and its mouth opened wider than it should have been, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I ran. I didn't look back. I don't even remember getting home, only that I locked every door and window and stayed up until the sun rose. The splashing didn't come that night, or any night after. The pool house door was locked again the next time I checked, the padlock looking as untouched as it had before. There was something. I moved to Hollow Lane last spring, thinking it was a fresh start. The neighborhood was picturesque, with rows of colonial-style homes and cherry blossoms lining the sidewalks. My house was the last one on the street, slightly set back from the others. It wasn't perfect, but it had charm. A sprawling oak tree shaded the front yard, and ivy crept up the brick facade. It felt secluded in a way that I thought I'd enjoy. I should have known something was off when the realtor avoided talking about the house next door. When I asked, she briefly explained that it had been empty for a while. That was all I got. No for sale sign, no indication of maintenance, no mention of who had lived there before. It looked like a mirror image of my own house, except it felt wrong. The windows were always dark, and the lawn was an overgrown mess that the Hoy suspiciously ignored. At first, I chalked it up to nerves. Moving to a new place, especially alone, can make you hyper-aware of your surroundings. I told myself that the flickering lights I occasionally saw from the upstairs window were just reflections. I convinced myself that the faint scraping noises late at night were raccoons or stray cats. I ignored how the air always seemed colder on that side of the yard, even on the warmest days. It was a Tuesday evening when I first noticed the shadow. While unpacking in the kitchen, I looked through the window above the sink, which gave me a perfect view of the neighbor's upstairs window. I saw something move behind the curtains. It wasn't a flicker or a trick of the light. It was a definite, deliberate motion. My stomach tightened. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I spent the next few days trying not to think about it. I avoided looking at the house and focused on getting settled. But the shadow returned, almost like it wanted me to notice. I started seeing it every night, always around the same time. It would appear in the same upstairs window, lingering just long enough for me to catch it out of the corner of my eye. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked Margaret, my neighbor 2 doors down, if she knew anything about the house. She spent most of her day watering flowers that didn't need it, so I figured she'd know the gossip. When I brought it up, she told me that the house had been empty for years, and that no one had been inside since the Hendersons left. I asked her why they left, but she only muttered something about bad energy before telling me to stay away from it. She advised that some things were better left alone, and then she returned to her roses. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan the house made. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It started as a faint rustling, like leaves scraping against the window. I told myself it was the wind, but then the sound shifted. It became a low, irregular tapping, deliberate and rhythmic. My curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. The shadow was back, but this time it wasn't in the upstairs window. It was outside, standing on the overgrown lawn between our houses. It didn't move, but I felt its presence as clearly as if it had been standing in my room. My hands shook as I closed the blinds. I didn't look outside again that night. The next morning I found footprints in the dirt under my window. They were large, barefoot, and left an imprint that seemed too deep for the damp soil. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it was an animal or some local kids playing a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I decided to call the police. When they arrived, the officer shined his flashlight around, asked me a few questions, and casually remarked that it was probably just a drifter. He advised me to lock my doors and let them know if it happened again. That night, I locked every door and window and left every light in the house on. I tried to distract myself with TV, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around 1 a.m., the power went out. The house fell into complete silence. I tried not to panic, telling myself it was just a blown fuse. I grabbed my phone for light and made my way to the breaker box in the basement. As I fumbled with the switches, I heard something upstairs. It started as a faint creak, like weight shifting on old floorboards. Then it became heavier, deliberate, like someone walking. I froze. The sound moved from the hallway to the stairs. I could feel the vibrations in the walls as the steps came closer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't heard anyone break in. The doors and windows were locked. The footsteps stopped just outside the basement door. I held my breath, waiting, hoping it would go away. Then the doorknob rattled. It wasn't violent, just a subtle testing motion. I backed into the corner, clutching my phone like it was a weapon. The rattling stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I found the door still locked. There was no sign of anyone in the house. The power came back on a few minutes later, and everything seemed normal. But I knew better. I didn't sleep that night or the next. The final straw came 3 days later. I woke up to find the back door wide open. I know for a fact I locked it. The footprints were back, but this time they weren't outside. They were in the kitchen, leading from the door to the stairs and back again. I packed a bag and left that afternoon. I haven't been back to Hollow Lane since. I don't know who or what was in that house, but I've stopped trying to figure it out. Some places aren't meant to be understood. Sometimes the darkness isn't hiding, it's waiting. I wasn't looking for excitement when I moved to Willow Drive. I wanted peace, and for the first few weeks, that's exactly what I got. The neighbors were friendly enough, though they didn't pry, which I appreciated. The house was small but comfortable, with a backyard that stretched further than I expected for a suburban lot. That was the selling point for me, the garden. I always imagined planting rows of vegetables and flowers, something to keep me busy. The house next door had a garden too, though it wasn't nearly as inviting. It was overgrown, a tangled mess of weeds and vines that crept up the sides of the house like they were trying to swallow it whole. The house itself looked abandoned, but every so often I'd catch glimpses of movement in the yard. A shadow darting behind the hedges, or the glint of something metallic in the brush. I told myself it was just wildlife, foxes maybe. The first time I heard the humming, I was sitting on my porch late one evening. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle. At first I thought it was a lawnmower or some kind of machinery, but it was too soft, too steady. It sounded almost like a voice, low and droning, rising and falling in a rhythm that was almost melodic. It was coming from the garden next door. I tried to ignore it. People hum, I told myself. It's not strange. But the sound didn't stop. It went on for hours, long after the street had fallen silent. I finally went inside, locking the door behind me, but even then, I could swear I heard it faintly through the walls. The next morning I peeked over the fence. The garden was just as wild and overgrown as before, but now it seemed deliberate. The vines twisted in strange, symmetrical patterns. The weeds were unnaturally tall, their tops curling like they were reaching for something. In the center of the yard was an old stone bird bath, completely dry but covered in a thick layer of moss. Something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't explain why. I decided to ask the neighbors about the house. Mrs. Calloway, the elderly woman across the street, was happy to oblige. She told me the house had been empty for years, ever since the Jenkins family left. No one had seen them go one day, they were just gone. She said that they had a beautiful garden. Mrs. Jenkins spent all her time out there. People used to say she had a green thumb like you wouldn't believe when I asked why the house hadn't been sold. She shrugged and said the bank owns it now, but no one wants it. Too much work to fix up, I guess. She didn't seem to notice when I glanced back at the garden, now a pulsating jungle of green. The humming came back that night. It was louder this time, and it had a strange cadence, like a chant. It made the hairs on my neck stand up. I couldn't sleep, so I sat by the window, staring at the dark mass of plants next door. The vines seemed to move in the moonlight, swaying gently as if stirred by an unseen breeze. I don't know what possessed me to go outside. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was nothing, that the garden was just an ordinary patch of weeds. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed over the fence. The air was damp and heavy, and the smell of earth was overwhelming. The flashlight beam barely pierced the darkness, illuminating only small patches of the yard. The humming grew louder as I moved closer to the center. It wasn't coming from a person, I was sure of that now. It seemed to emanate from the ground itself, vibrating through my feet. I stopped in front of the bird bath. Up close, it was much larger than it looked from my porch. The moss covering it wasn't moss at all, but some kind of thick, pulsating growth. I reached out instinctively, and the second my fingers brushed it, the humming stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed down on me, suffocating, as if the air had turned solid. Then slowly the vines began to move, not swaying like before, but writhing, twisting toward me. I stumbled back, but the ground was soft, almost spongy, and I lost my footing. As I scrambled to stand, I felt something brush against my ankle. When I looked down, a vine was coiled around my leg, tightening with unnatural strength. I kicked and thrashed, my flashlight flying from my hand. The vine pulled harder, dragging me toward the bird bath. My hands clawed at the ground, grasping for anything to hold onto. Just as the rim of the bird bath loomed above me, the vine loosened. I didn't hesitate. I ran, tripping over the tangled growth, tearing my clothes on thorns and branches. When I finally made it over the fence, I didn't stop running until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my living room, staring at the window, waiting for the vines to come crashing through. But nothing happened. When the sun rose, the garden next door looked just as it always had, wild, overgrown, and impossibly still. I called a landscaper the next day. I told him I wanted my fence extended, high enough to block the view of the neighbor's yard. He came by that afternoon to give me an estimate, but when I pointed out the garden, he went pale. He quickly said that he didn't do that kind of work, and then he left without another word. I haven't gone near the garden since. The humming hasn't come back, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint rustling, like leaves brushing against each other. I've considered moving, but I'm afraid it won't matter. Whatever is in that garden feels alive, aware. It let me go once, but I don't think it will a second time. It wasn't the kind of thing I'd ever thought I'd notice, but once I did, I couldn't unsee it. The house at 14 Alder Grove had a blue door. Not a cheerful blue, like robin's egg or sky. It was a flat, dull blue, like the color had been leached of all vibrancy. Every other house on the block had white doors, as per the strict HOA guidelines. But this one didn't, and no one seemed to care. I moved to Alder Grove about 6 months ago. A modest neighborhood, clean and quiet, the sort of place where retirees walked their dogs in the early morning and kids played basketball in the afternoons. It was comfortable, predictable, exactly what I was looking for. But the house with the blue door felt different from the moment I laid eyes on it. At first it was just an oddity. I asked a few neighbors about it while making casual conversation. Most shrugged and said the house had been empty for years, but they didn't know why. One older woman, Mrs. Jenkins, whispered that the family who lived there left suddenly and didn't tell anyone where they'd gone. She said that it had just been that way, glancing toward the house like she expected it to overhear. I decided to let it go. A weird door wasn't my problem, but it quickly became clear that the house wanted to be my problem. It started with the mail. I'd find random envelopes in my mailbox addressed to 14 Alder Grove, even though no one lived there. At first, I assumed it was just a postal mistake. I'd walk over and leave the letters on the porch. But after a few weeks, the mail kept coming, and it got stranger. No stamps, no return addresses, just blank envelopes with the same spidery handwriting. I stopped delivering them and shoved them into a drawer instead. The next thing was the lights. Every so often, late at night, the windows of the blue-deured house would glow faintly. Not the warm yellow of lamps, but a cold bluish hue, like the screen of an old TV. It didn't happen every night, just often enough to keep me on edge. I'd stare at the house from my bedroom window trying to make out the source of the light, but it would always fade before I could figure it out. I finally decided to check it out up close. One Saturday in broad daylight, I walked over to the house and peered through the front window. The interior was dark and empty. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture was draped in faded sheets. It looked like no one had been inside for years, which didn't explain the lights. Feeling bold, or maybe stupid, I tried the doorknob. It was locked, of course. But as I stepped back, I noticed something odd. The blue paint wasn't just dull, it was wrong. The texture was almost organic, like it was pulsing under the surface. I reached out to touch it, and my fingers brushed something warm. I jerked my hand back and hurried home, heart pounding. That night, I dreamed about the house. In the dream, I was standing on its porch, staring at the blue door. It opened slowly, creaking on its hinges, and I could see nothing but darkness beyond it. Then something stepped out, a tall, featureless shadow. I woke up drenched in sweat. I told myself it was just a dream, but the house seemed to know I'd been there. The next day, one of the blank envelopes appeared on my doorstep. This time there was something inside. A photograph. It was grainy, black and white, and showed a small boy standing in front of the blue door. His face was turned toward the camera, but it was blurred, almost as if it had been smeared by an unseen hand. I decided to throw the photo away. I didn't even want it in my house. But when I opened the trash can to toss it in, I saw something that made me freeze. At the very bottom of the bin, another photograph stared back at me. It was the same boy, the same blue door, but this time he was closer to the camera. His face was still blurred, but his hand was reaching out, as if inviting me in. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on and sat in my living room, staring at the photo I'd taken out of the trash. It was sitting on my coffee table, though I couldn't remember putting it there. Around 3 a.m., I heard a faint knocking at my door. It wasn't frantic, just soft and deliberate. Knock, 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 and knock. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The knocking came again, a little louder this time. I forced myself to stand and look through the peephole. No one was there. I sat back down, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but then I heard it again, knocking, knocking, now coming from the back door. I didn't look this time. I just sat there, paralyzed, as the knocking moved around the house, from one door to the next, from one window to another. It went on for hours. The sun rose and the knocking finally stopped. I went outside, half expecting to find someone waiting for me. But the yard was empty, and the only thing out of place was a new photograph on my front porch. This one showed the boy standing inside the house with the blue door. He was no longer blurred. His face was pale, gaunt, and impossibly familiar. It was my face. I've thought about leaving, but I don't think it would help. The house knows me now. The lights are brighter every night, and the knocking starts earlier. Last night I heard footsteps on the stairs inside my own home. I locked the bedroom door, but I don't think it'll matter. I haven't gone back to the blue door. I know if I do, it'll open for me, and I don't think I'll come back.